can you quickly check why people are not able to? I'll end this poll and run the second question. Yeah, is it there? If people can participate in this. Yeah, now it is. I can see. So thank you so much for this. I'll run the previous questions now. So the question will be up for 1 minute, and I request you to give your opinion. The question is, which is the main reason that India cannot have such a bold reform in today's era? There are two options. Worldwide, the focus has shifted from free trade and economic growth to the redesigning poverty alleviation and redistribution programs. And the second one, the bureaucratic and political system lacks cross-party consensus. So the poll will be up for 30 more seconds, and then I'll share the result. So those who are joining just now, I request you to participate.
What are the answers to the first questions?
So I'll share the result. That will be
okay. All right.
So I'll be ending the poll in the next 15 seconds, and then I'll share the result. I request others also to quickly give your opinion. That will be very helpful. So thank you very much. I end the poll now, and I share the result, and I request Dr. Ahluwalia to just have a quick look. The majority goes to the second option. The bureaucratic and political system lacks cross-party consensus. So thank you so much. I run the next poll, which is the first one, and that was a very important question, so I would like to repeat, and I request everyone to participate. The question is, which one is the main reason for the 1991 economic reforms? And there are options: due to the balance of payment, due to the excessive inflation, due to Iraq war, petrol prices rose and the flow of foreign currency from Gulf countries stopped, due to the dismal performance of the public sector undertakings, and due to the success of East Asian economies, especially China and South Korea. So the question is up. I think there is again a problem. So I'll run the last one, and then I'll close this. Here is the last poll question. What could be the main reason for the lack of jobs despite higher growth post-liberalization? There are options. Most of the people from the unviable farming sector end up in the low wages informal sector. Second one is, in the formal sector, workers employed by contractors have increased over the years. The next option is lack of formal education and other barriers to entry in the formal sector. And last one is due to the increased import competition. Manufacturers seek to improve their competitiveness by paying lower wages to informal workers. So I request you to look at this one and give your opinion. The question will be up for 30 more seconds. So thank you so much. 15 more seconds, and then I'll close this. So I can see responses coming in quickly. So thank you so much for participating. I end this poll and share the result to our guest. And the question is, what could be the main reason for the lack of jobs despite higher growth post-liberalization? And it is like there are two options. First one, most of the people from unviable farming sector end up in the low wages. And the third option, people seem to agree on both these two options. So I stop sharing this poll now. Thank you so much for participating. And again, I welcome everyone to Ahmedabad University. We are a research university and we believe in a different kind of education. And this is one such platform, the Conversation Series, where we invite deep thinkers and policymakers, and we provide a platform for people and for the university community to interact with them. I welcome you again. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest. We are truly honored to have Dr. Momentous Ahluwalia. He served as one of India's senior economic policymakers for 3 decades and played a crucial role in the country's turn from a state-run to a market-based economy. He was Special Secretary to the Prime Minister in the 1980s and Commerce Secretary and Finance Secretary in the 1990s. He took a break from the government in 2001 when the IMF selected him as the first director of their newly created Independent Evaluation Office. He returned in 2004 to the Government of India as the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission with the rank of a Cabinet Minister, a position he held up till May 2014. He was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian honor, by the President of India in 2011 for his outstanding contribution to the economy and public policy. Uh, we are truly honored to have you, Dr. Eluwalia, at Ahmedabad University. This is a pleasure to have you, and we are privileged to have you today. You don't need any introduction, but I just wanted to read it out. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the interaction with all the people, some of whom I can see on the screen. I don't know whether I'm allowed to put in a little advertisement for my book, but I think I feel compelled to do so. So those of you who haven't actually seen it, this is what it looks like. And I just suggest that while I will be ranging over different issues, you probably get a better picture of what I really think by reading the book. So let me recommend that to all of you in the hope that you will get a better understanding of what my views are. But meanwhile, I mean, by all means, let us discuss as you pose questions to me. So why don't I invite that?
Yeah, thank you so much. The person who will be in conversation with Dr. Eluwalia is Professor Ravi Miglani. He is a professor of practice of management and executive director of our executive education. He'll be interacting with you. Before I hand it over to Professor Miglani, there are some admin rules. Everybody will be muted, audio and video both, during the conversation. And as the conversation goes, I request people to put their comments in the everyone chat box so that we can take all these questions and curate it. And at the end, we'll get back to both the speakers. You can see all the questions there, and then you can put it up, and accordingly, we'll take it forward. So welcome again. And at last, we also welcome to the people from media who has joined us, and they are here. So we welcome you again. And then I quickly hand it over to Professor Miglani for the.
Thank you, Sudhir, and welcome again, Dr. Aluwalia. And I won't repeat what Sudhir said, but I am personally truly honored to get a chance to speak with you. I've been reading your work and hearing about your contributions for the past 4 decades now, and I'm old enough to remember the early 80s when you started appearing in the economics media and then in the popular media after 1990s. So I've been following you for a few decades, so it's truly an honor. And I can start with supporting Dr. Aluwalia's advertisement for the book. And here's the Kindle version of the book if you are not into reading the paper version. Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. And it is truly a story behind India's high because of the behind the scenes activities that Dr. Aluwalia was privy to and engineered many of those things are truly behind the scenes, and many of us didn't know these things that were happening in the room where Dr. Aluwalia was. Just to start off on what kinds of topics we'll be discussing, let me just read the first few lines from the preface of your book, Dr. Aluwalia. This book is not a memoir, you write. This book is not a memoir. I was turned off the idea of writing a memoir after I heard someone refer to them as selfies in book form, which was a very interesting description. I present this book to the reader as a travelogue of India's journey of economic reforms, in which I had the privilege of being an insider for 30 long years. So that was the perfect way to start the book. And taking a cue from you, we will focus on the memoir of India's journey rather than your personal journey. So let's look at that journey, because you were literally, as they say, in the room where it happened. In every room where all those things happened, you were there. You were a key architect of the reforms for more than a decade before 1991. and for 2 decades after 1991. And I believe the story is especially important today, and we are doing it in the 30th anniversary year of 1991 reforms. It's especially relevant today because almost two-thirds of the people living in the country today were not even born in 1991, which is a scary thought. Firstly, it makes me feel very old that two-thirds of the people and maybe two-thirds of our audience were not even born in 1991. So they don't know the pre-1991 India. They don't know that I personally, for example, had to wait 5 years to get my first Bajaj scooter. They don't know that we had to stand in line with a ration card in hand to get dal and chawal, and we got more stones than dal in that dal that we got. We don't know that the exciting choices that people had was between an ambassador car and a Premier Padmini, and that's it. And people don't know that if they were fortunate enough to travel abroad, they had to do long paperwork to get $100 to be able to get permission to change money to travel abroad. Those are things that are not known to a large part of the country today because they were not there. And I think it's important for the younger generation to know where it all came from and how privileged we are today, thanks to Dr. Aluwalia and people like him, on how the country was transformed over the course of just 2 decades. So to be able to understand that, where I would want you, Dr. Aluwalia, to start is tell us the backstory, literally, as you say, on how we arrived at 1991, because obviously it was not that one fine day an asteroid struck the planet and Dr. Manmohan Singh stood up with his budget speech on 24th of July 1991. It had been simmering for a long time. It's a slow boil reform. It's not just one fine morning, all of you got into a room and had a brainwave. You had all been discussing it for more than a decade. It was like milk slowly heating and then coming to a boil and suddenly it's overflowing. But it doesn't overflow suddenly. It heats up for a long time before it overflows. So could you, to begin, take us through those years, the 10, 12 years before 91, and what made 91 inevitable?
Now, that's a very nice way of putting it. I must thank you for the very kind words that you've used about me. I mean, it's very nice to be described as the architect of the reforms, but actually, the honest truth, as I say in my book, I was fortunate to be the right guy at the right time, and there wasn't one architect. I mean, I think, as you imply, these thoughts had been simmering in the system. But I hope people will read the book, the chapter on the 1980s. If one looks at it going back, the one question that one would ask is that clearly the system had worked out that the control regime that had developed over the many years was dysfunctional. I think that's very clear. Uh, our economic performance in the early 60s was not so bad compared to the rest of the world. So in that sense, a lot of people blame the Nehruvian period. Actually, the real problems began post-Nehru. And in the mid-60s, right through the end of the 70s, performance of the economy was pretty poor. And if you looked at, I only came back in 79, and when you're abroad, you can actually see a little more clearly what's happening. And it was very clear that we were falling behind. And many of our friends abroad were also pointing that out. And some changes had begun to be made, but they were very slow, hesitant. You mentioned that you had to wait for several years to get a Bajaj scooter. The interesting thing is, in those years, Bajaj wasn't allowed to produce more scooters, although he wanted to. In fact, he used to get a big laugh in international gatherings when he said that, look, I'm a the producer of India's favorite scooter, and there are 10-year waiting lists for my scooter. But I'm not allowed to produce more than my stated capacity. Now that's just idiotic. And it's nice to say that now, and it really puzzles me why in 1980 enough people didn't get up and say, "What is this rubbish? Let's change it all." I mean, I think we should have done much more. You know, in a way, when Mrs. Gandhi came back to power in we had the period of the post-emergency Raji Desai's government. He was supposed to be not a very socialistic kind of person, but I'm afraid he didn't use his period in government to reverse economic policy as I think he should have. So that part got a bit wasted. Mrs. Gandhi comes back in 1980. She begins to make some changes. So the thinking had begun that we are not really performing very well. Middle of the 1980s, following her, Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated, and after this traumatic event, Rajiv Gandhi moves in, becomes prime minister, wins a huge majority, goes to parliament. And, you know, in February in parliament, I mean, he had talked about taking India to the 21st century. Now, you know, as a young man, it appealed to youth. He was about 40, so I was also around 40 at the time. And I could see that people felt that he was being seen as a breath of fresh air. He didn't carry any baggage of the old policies. He had not been in government before, etc., except for 3 years or so. And you know, in his among earlier speeches in Parliament, he said that look, India cannot compete if we are working with systems that are 10 and 20 years out of date. Now, no prime minister had often said, yes, we are not doing well, we must do better, etc. But no prime minister had actually attacked the system, and he did. But he wasn't able to do very much about it. Now, that's an interesting question. Why is it that the system did not respond by analytically saying, look, you said the system is lousy, this is what's lousy. And I think we can go into that in detail if you want. But for one reason or another, changes were made, but they were made incrementally. I mean, for example, on the licensing, instead of saying, look, these licensing of capacities are ridiculous, they said, well, we'll have automatic expansion of licensing, 5% every year, subject to 25% over a 5-year period. Now, you know, this meant that Rahul Bajaj could produce 5% more scooters, even though there was an excess demand of scooters of almost 400%. You know, the response was disproportionate to the need. You know, one of the reasons for that was that any expansion of production requires an expansion of inputs, and many of these inputs are imported. And India had acquired after the war and during independence a great belief that we must conserve our foreign exchange and ration it and approve individual imports for the most part. And this was really a dysfunctional system, because babus cannot really decide what is it that a producer needs to be efficient. It's much better to give that choice to him rather than have some Directorate General of Technical Development, the DGTD, which used to make these decisions. And I describe what happened in the Maruti case. You know, Maruti was a breakthrough. It was a public sector unit, but it was a very special unit. But it was producing cars, not heavy machinery, etc., and so on. So it was producing something that would require consumers to like it, and they were incredibly successful. They produced the first really modern car in India, because before that, these Padminis and so on, they were mid 50s, early 60s models. Suddenly you got a contemporary model. Now, one of their requirements was that after a couple of years, they would start producing the engine block domestically. Okay? And so they said, yeah, we're ready to produce the engine block domestically, but we need high quality machine tools, and we have to import those. So they applied for permission to import the machine tools. Now, this application went to DGTD. DGTD said, no, there's no case for allowing this because HMT, which was another public sector company, produces machine tools. So let them tell HMT what they want and HMT will produce them. Now, when this thing came up, I mean, Maruti senior management, RC Bhargav, he made the point that look, HMT is not capable of producing the kind of machine tools which require the kind of quality that we need for an engine block of a modern car. And so he was told, but they're doing it for Bajaj scooters. So Bhargav said, look, a scooter's engine block is a much more simple thing compared to a car's engine block. They wouldn't believe him. So finally, there was a meeting in the Minister of Industry's room where Bhargav had to bring an engine block of a scooter and put it on the table, and then have 3 or 4 people carry the engine block of the Maruti and put it on the table and explain to the minister that, look, this is so much more complex. Just because you can produce this little thing doesn't mean you can produce this other. As it happened, he got the permission to import the machine tool. But I'm not sure whether this was by overruling the opposition of the DGTD. I just mentioned this that, when you get into a system where decisions that should be taken by the entrepreneur get subjected to bureaucratic oversight, very often the people actually making those decisions do not themselves have the experience necessary to judge. And it's a system that's bound to lead to inefficiency. And the way it worked was that I will deny you the right to import what you think you need. And if you think that makes you uncompetitive, I will protect your market so you will be able to sell it anyway. Now, that's a recipe for disaster, and that's what our policy was. So when I sit back, I think it's pretty odd that we didn't get to change it faster. I'm not a great believer in changing things all of a sudden. Big bang reforms change everything. I mean, I share the view of Deng Xiaoping that, you cross the river while feeling the stones. But you don't just sit on the river and feel the stone, you actually try to cross the river, which means that you must show significant forward movement. And I think if we had done that, the reforms which took about 15 years or so would have been done in 5 or 7. So we should have done that. That was a mistake. Now, what happened in 91? Well, I think, first of all, many people have come to realize that this system isn't working and we need to give freedom. When the election, Rajiv Gandhi went for elections in 1989, and at that time, obviously government comes to a stop while elections are going on. And my boss in the Prime Minister's office was B.G. Deshmukh, very distinguished, very, very honest, very far-sighted civil servant from Maharashtra. And he was saying to me that, why is it that we are not able, when we talk with each other, we all seem to know what's wrong. So why don't we get something done? So I told him that the reason is that we don't have a holistic view of looking at what is going wrong. If we want more exports, we tell the Commerce Ministry that you must promote exports. But the problem is that half the problem with exports is that your exchange rate is uncompetitive. That's not in the purview of the Commerce Ministry. That's decided by the RBI and the Finance Ministry. The other problem is that your exporters cannot get freely the kind of inputs they need. And sometimes their suppliers cannot get the inputs they need to produce high quality goods. That again is decided by the DGTD. Should it be imported? Should it not be imported? And I think we need to take a comprehensive view and say that, look, in order to make changes, these are the 6 or 7 areas that change has to be made. And you must take a holistic view and make sure that all these changes happen together. If you don't do that, you will just run into problems. I mean, for example, you might say, why should you have industrial licensing? Let's free it all up. So whoever wants to set up a factory can set up a factory. That's fine. But when they set up factories, they'll all want to import capital goods. So instead of queuing up in the Ministry of Industry, they'll start queuing up in the Commerce Ministry wanting licenses for imports. And when those licenses are demanded, the Finance Ministry will say, no, no, there's too much demand here. You must deny many of them. Whereas actually, if you were to have a flexible exchange rate, and basically if there's too much demand for imports, the exchange rate will depreciate, and that will automatically limit the demand for imports. At least it will limit the demand for those imports that can be efficiently produced domestically. And only if you let this whole system operate will you see the success. So he said, why don't you work on a paper on that? Well, I started working. The government changed. Rajiv Gandhi lost the election. He came back with almost 200 seats. But he was very particular that he felt that the government had lost the majority, lost the confidence of the people. So we shouldn't try to cobble together a majority. We'll sit in the opposition. So in came a coalition government which had VP Singh in it, and many other people, etc. And I happened to, and VP Singh actually was himself a reformer. Because he had worked with Rajiv Gandhi on tax reforms, etc., before they fell out on the whole issue of defense imports, corruption, etc. He went to Malaysia on some bilateral trip, and I was part of his delegation. VP Singh said to me that, I'm amazed at what has happened in Kuala Lumpur because I used to visit this place in 1973 and it was really quite backward. And look what they've done. So I said, you're right, because I used to visit this place also from the World Bank at about the same time. And I'm amazed at the changes. So Mr. Singh said, why do you think that's true? I said, that's because they've done a lot of reforms and we are not reforming at all. So he said to me that, all right, you prepare a paper. What is it that we should do? So because of this chance thing, I got a mandate from him to prepare a paper. So I put together my ideas. This is what later on became called, as I described in the book, the M document. And now VP Singh could have ignored, he had many political preoccupations, Mandal agitation going on, problems with handling Kashmir, handling Punjab. He really didn't have an easy time. But I think deep down he knew that these are the things we have to do. So instead of just sitting on the paper, which he could easily have done, he sent it off to the cabinet secretary and said, call him committee of secretaries to discuss this. He never, by the way, said that I approve this. He said this is worth discussing. And we had these discussions, and I was very pleased to see that many people in the system, when this was pointed out, agreed with what I was saying. Actually, it's not that none of the individual things I was saying were new, because many of these people had themselves recommended it, but they had not anticipated the objections that would come, and hence the need for a holistic view. So we had a big discussion. The paper leaked out in the press. Some people criticized, some people didn't criticize. And in the end, we were able to make these changes only after the crisis of 1990. Many people think that we had a serious balance of payments crisis. Partly that was due to a lot of fiscal expansion in the later years of the Gandhi government. Many people thought that the reforms were done because we needed money and the IMF would not have given us the money if we hadn't done the reforms. It's true that the IMF would not have given us money if we hadn't done some reforms. But the IMF was not asking for the broad-ranging reforms that we did. As a matter of fact, they were surprised by the depth of the reforms, which were entirely the result of our own internal thinking that, look, we need to make a change. So the reforms were triggered by the crisis. I think this was one of the questions you had earlier. It's true that we needed to do reforms, but the crisis was over by 1993 and we had stopped borrowing. The reforms carried on in a slow sort of way. So I think we were put on a path of strong reforms because, in my view, the crisis was an opportunity and there was an internal building up of opinion that this is the way to go. And I think we were lucky that we managed to do that. And the performance of the economy kept on increasing over time. And really, one of the very positive things about the reform is that, subsequent governments, the United Front government, which replaced the Narasimha Rao government, then the Vajpayee government, which replaced the United Front government, they were all willing to continue down the same path. I mean, many of them had criticized these reforms when they were in opposition. But when they came to power, they saw the purpose and saw the continuity. And in a country as a whole, I do think that this balancing, when you are a politician, you criticize the government, you criticize the fellows who preceded you. But I think one of the signals you must also give is that there is a consensus in the country, an underlying consensus of where to move. You can then exaggerate whatever you're doing and say, I'm doing wonderful things, which is part of competitive politics. And I think these successive governments, then followed by the UPA government, which also continued down the same path, it created a feeling that India is on the path of reforms, and that feeling kind of continues even now. I mean, we are going through all sorts of short-term problems that we can discuss if you wish. But the bottom line is that people feel that as long as India gets a fair chance to compete, India has the capacity to do well. There is some rethinking, some doubts are being expressed nowadays that, is the world going to remain open, etc. That's something we can discuss if you want.
Yeah, maybe
But
Dr.
that's,
Ahluwalia, in this latter half of the conversation, let's come to the last few years and
yeah, okay.
but just staying up to the lead up to 91, as you've said, you had these ideas from almost like 1979 when you came back to India. You are being modest, but that document that you wrote, the paper that you wrote, which got dubbed as the M document, was actually a very crucial document. And I've read that myself, and I've read descriptions of it in your book and other places. That document had practically everything, and it had been mulling in your mind, or in some forms the document had been around for a few years. I believe you tried to pitch it to Rajiv Gandhi, and it probably wasn't the right time. So all of these things were brewing, and as they say, no one can stop an idea whose time has come. The idea's time had come in 91, but it was not certain a big blast in 91. These had been brewing. I just want to push you a bit more into understanding. When you say these ideas were there, you knew what had to be done, and probably Rajiv Gandhi or even VP Singh, and there were many reform-minded, both on the politician side like Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh, and maybe Yashwant Sinha and so on, as well as on the bureaucracy side and the public policy side like yourself and various other people like Rakesh Mohan and A.N. Verma and Dr. Rangarajan and so on. So all of you knew what had to be done. So I'm trying to pass out, when you say the system did not let you do it, you were the system. So why wasn't it possible during Rajiv Gandhi's period, VP Singh's period, and so on?
No, it's a good question. I mean, the politics during, I personally think that Rajiv Gandhi had the right instincts, but the political environment at the time was not something that he was able to handle. See, one of the important things is that when Mr. Narasimha Rao came in, he was able to say that, look, this is a complete mess, and you can imply that the mess was made by the previous government. Now, Rajiv Gandhi came in as Prime Minister following the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, a traumatic thing for a country. And he was not in a position to distance himself from what went before. I mean, after all, his strong point and Congress's strong point at the time was that they are offering continuity, not change. So this is one important factor. I think the second important factor is that in economic terms, 1985, which is when he came in, was not a crisis year. I mean, things were getting along, things were improving, maybe too slowly, but they were improving. So he couldn't say that, this is a complete mess and I have to handle this. That's second point. I think the third point, quite honestly, is that I don't think his colleagues in Congress shared his view, with the possible exception of VP Singh. I mean, in that government, Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh both shared the view that we must have reform. They were both roughly the same age, younger people, etc. The senior Congress leaders did not think there was any need to change. So these two were, in that sense, a slight exception. It's a great pity that they fell out within 2 years, so that team instantly broke up. You know, I mentioned the same thing happened, I mean, in China, that when Deng Xiaoping came in, or let me take a break. Somebody asked, I think Veer Sanghvi and Avik Sarkar interviewed Rajiv Gandhi just after he lost the 89 elections. And they said to him that, look, you had all these ideas. Why are we not able to implement them? And you know, Rajiv Gandhi was very frank in the answer. He said, well, he thought about it and he said, lack of experience. I mean, a frank admission that, you know, being prime minister of a country without having political experience does mean. I think he was hinting at the time that if I come back again, I'll have much more experience and therefore I'll be more easily able to do things. But at that time, he admitted lack of experience. And, you know, what Deng Xiaoping had done is that he didn't rush the reforms through. I mean, remember, Deng Xiaoping more or less unwound the legacy of Mao Zedong, but he never once criticized Mao Zedong. He wanted to maintain that continuity because it gave political legitimacy and do things differently on the economic front. Probably Rajiv Gandhi was in a similar sort of situation. But I think what Deng did, he had huge experience. He had been in the Communist Party for 30 years or so. So he knew everybody, he knew what the opinions of different people were, etc. And as is brought out in the book by Frank Vogel, which I mentioned in my book also, you know, he spent a lot of time positioning the right people within the senior party hierarchy who would support him. I don't think Rajiv Gandhi did any of that. As a matter of fact, in the first 3-4 years, he lost the younger people who instinctively were on his side. I mean, he lost VP Singh, he lost Arun Singh, he lost Arif Muhammad Khan, some of the younger people that were associated with the new, and he was left with the older guard. And I don't think the older guard shared his view on economic reforms at all. So I think there wasn't enough political preparation. And that, to an extent, is what happened in the reorganization of the Congress Party. I mean, he gave this fantastic speech in December of 1985 saying, you know, we must reform the Congress Party, must have elections for president, get rid of the brokers of power, etc., etc., but wasn't able to deliver that. So actually making change in a complex society, which is also a democracy, does require experience, and he didn't have that experience. So some of these things, I think, explain why these ideas never got anywhere. But in due course, the thought was simmering. People were thinking about it. You know, after my M document sort of leaked into the press, there was a lot of debate, etc. Dr. Manmohan Singh, during the Chandrasekhar government, was an advisor to the Prime Minister. He had read it. He gave a lecture to the Institute of Management in Bangalore in, I think, January or something, February of 1991, and well before he became finance minister. In fact, during the Chandrasekhar government. And in that, he went beyond the stuff that I had said, took it a little further, and said, look, this is what we have to do in economic policy. That's a reflection of the fact that this thinking was going on. Now, we are very fortunate that Mr. Narasimha Rao, when he became Prime Minister, first of all chose Manmohan Singh, and he backed him. I mean, frankly, without the Prime Minister backing him, it would have been the easiest thing to derail these reforms, because none of the other cabinet, with the exception of Chidambaram, none of the other cabinet ministers were in favor of these reforms. He backed him. Manmohan Singh understood that you need to do all of these things together, and he had great persuasive capacity. You know, his budget speech of 1991, I think you were quoting from it when you said nothing can, well, he was quoting Victor Hugo, nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and you also repeated that. The thing is that being a professor, he was quite good at explaining to people why we have to do certain things. You know, during the reforms, just before the budget speech, he called a bunch of secretaries to his room. I mean, all the senior secretaries. I was then commerce secretary, so I was also called. And he said, look, we've decided we're going to make big changes. They're necessary. They're necessary for the good of the country. He said, but I realize that some of you, because you've grown up in a different sort of system, some of you may have doubts. I would not like to push you to do something which is contrary to what you think is right. So if you're unhappy with the direction, let me know and we will give you some other equally good assignment. So on the one hand, he was saying, look, I mean, you guys are all the technocracy. I'm sure you understand the rationale. So please help us. We need your help. He said that. We need your help. Without your help, we can't do it. But he also recognized that some of you come from a different, some of you may be favoring the older approach, which is fine. Just let me know. I don't want that this should be sabotaged. We'll give you some other job, which is very nice. And actually, Finance Secretary S.P. Shukla, Economic Secretary S.P. Shukla, did go with the older, more control-oriented regime. And they offered him the executive directorship of the ADB, a very attractive, well-paying job. I mean, Shukla was a very principled person, and he could see that he's being pushed out, albeit in a very respectable way, and he refused to do that. And he said, no, I prefer to resign, which I mean, as a personal action, is a very principled action. But as far as the government is concerned, they didn't just shove him off somewhere. They gave him a pretty good option. So the concept of putting together a team, in fact, that's when I was brought in after Shukla left. Concept of putting together a team of people who will work together was very important. And, you know, Manmohan Singh was himself a former civil servant. So all these so-called, we were the so-called senior fellows, but we had all been junior to him when he was in the civil service. Rangarajan is a good example. So they all knew him and respected him. And I think these factors made a difference. If you want to do reform, you need a team. The team can either be a political team where everybody is very clear and then they take charge and tell their secretaries what to do. If you don't have that, then you better get the team of secretaries which shares your thinking and pushes it forward.
Yeah, okay, just staying in those few months, the early months of 1991 leading up to July 24th, the day of the budget speech. Critics of that period, and they will be critics of anything, critics of that period would say that these reforms, because the system and the players in the system, whether at the political level or at the secretary's level, knew what had to be done for the previous at least 5, 6, 7 years, and it wasn't done. So it was not so much. Some media people came up with puns like, it was not the right people at the right time, it was right people at the tight time. And the tight time being there was no option, and the international financial institutions arm twisted India into doing those reforms. Would you?
No, I completely disagree with that. I'll tell you why. It's absolutely true that we would not have got the money we needed to manage the balance of payments if the IMF had not been willing to give it to us. And it's also true that they would have insisted on some reforms. Okay, I think they wanted a reduction in the fiscal deficit, which even the previous government had agreed to, Chandrasekhar and company, and was obvious that the fiscal deficit was too high. They also insisted on a devaluation. In my view, they were right to do so. That was a controversial thing. But most of the rest of what we did, they were not insisting on. And as a matter of fact, the crisis was over by 1993. By 1993, we told the IMF, we don't need your money anymore. We're not going to draw the last resort, last tranche. Okay? But reforms continued after 1993, albeit in a gradual way. So if we were all yearning to get back to the bad old days, but were simply forced to be good boys because of the IMF, we would have just gone back. We recognize that it's like saying to the IMF, look, you're a hospital and we have a right to go for hospital treatment. Thank you very much. We're now out of ICU. Now we're getting out and doing our own thing, but we did sensible things. And the IMF people that I knew, they told me that, look, we were surprised that, for example, they would have insisted on a devaluation, and we did a devaluation. They were not insisting that you go to a market-determined exchange rate. That's what we did within 1 year. When Chidambaram he was the one who was my minister. We brought in the trade reforms. First of all, convincing Chidambaram was critical, because if he had not been convinced, that would have been the end of trade reforms. We both went to Manmohan Singh and persuaded him. He knew the logic of it. His own civil service fellows were against it, but he overruled them. So, and I've described all this in all economic matters, there are differences of view, and when those differences arise, somebody has to abjudicate. In the end, if Manmohan Singh had not agreed with Chidambaram, the reforms would have been dead, because Chidambaram and I persuaded Manmohan Singh that he was going to withdraw the cash compensatory support because of the devaluation. Our whole point was we are doing trade reforms, and those days bringing in the EXIM script. And we don't want you to just announce withdrawal of cash compensatory support. Announce this thing together. That was the whole logic also of the M document. Put it all together. And he said that, okay, we'll have to get the Prime Minister's approval, because in those days, all these things needed the PM's approval. So we went off to Narasimha Rao's office, Chidambaram, Manmohan Singh. Chidambaram explained to Narasimha Rao what we were proposing. Narasimha Rao just looked at Manmohan Singh and said, look, are you supporting this? He said, yes, sir, I've signed. So Narasimha Rao called for the file and signed it. I mean, no committee of secretaries sending the thing into a spin call. Even the PMO, although, Verma would have been very supportive, but even the PMO was not actually involved. Narasimha Rao totally trusted Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh backed it, done. Now, I have written in my book that I was personally delighted to have the opportunity to be present on an occasion when the Indian system acted so decisively that something that had been part of established law for years got abolished at one stroke. And I just wish we had more such things in subsequent years. Unfortunately, we didn't. But these are not things that the IMF was insisting on. Yes, these were coming out of whatever thinking had gone on internally in the government and outside also. Because Manmohan Singh organized, there was big opposition from the left in West Bengal, then ruled by CPM. In fact, these big changes were made even before the budget. Because the budget was the 24th of July, and the trade policy announcements and the devaluation happened on the 3rd of July or something like that. The budget became an opportunity to explain these changes, not to announce them. Even the industrial policy was already announced 5 hours before the budget. And Manmohan Singh explained all that. Everybody regards his budget as historic. It was historic, not because it announced historic things, but it provided the rationale for what had already been done. Okay, and that's quite an interesting feature. Yeah, but exactly. I think it reflects the fact that there was a lot of thinking at that time in government, which surfaced in a good way. Yeah, and of course we continued lots of reforms, particularly the opening up on the international capital market. There used to be a lot of concern that if you open up on the capital market, you'll be swamped. And we agreed with that. That's why the opening was very gradual. Yeah. First open to FDI, not open to debt, and so on and so on.
Yeah, in reading about those few days from early July to the 24th of July, of like every morning there was breaking news like trade policy, industrial policy, one devaluation, another devaluation. It reads like a thriller. I mean,
Yeah, I agree with you.
I can only imagine like in the span of like 24 days, so much happened which hadn't happened maybe for a decade
Yeah,
before. Yeah. So just one last thing to zoom in even further on those days before I think a lot of our audience wants your views on today and the future. But before we get to that, those first few months of 1991 were completely chaotic. Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, and then a short lived VP Singh government, then a short lived Chandrasekhar government, then the SNP and downgraded India's rating, then very emotionally, like very public things like 20 tons of gold being sold by India to raise money to survive for 2 weeks and so on. When so much turmoil is going on, as a layman, we would expect that a new government will come and try and uh, calm things down and not do anything dramatic and let the chaos settle down. So, what I wanted to understand was what was the thinking that let's rock the boat even more. The boat was completely rocking, and there were several balls up in the air, and let's juggle a few more balls. So you were in exactly in the room. What was the thinking that let instead of calming things down, let's blow them
yeah.
up
No,
even
that's
more?
very good. I'm glad you're giving me the opportunity to share some memories. You know, when the government took over, the cabinet secretary of the time called on the prime minister elect, Mr. Narasimha Rao, and told him that look, things are pretty bad, and you're going to have to do something dramatic. So that's fine. That then he had got Manmohan Singh on board, etc. Though we didn't know at the time that he was going to be finance minister. Just before the swearing in was to take place, I got a phone call from the cabinet secretary that the prime minister wants to meet with 6 or 7 of the economic secretaries, and you are one of them. So you please turn up. So we turned up. A very exciting new prime minister. And Mr. Narasimha Rao was very clear. He said that look, we're in a mess. We're going to have to do things differently. And he specifically, I mentioned this in the book, he said, we have got to get rid of the cobwebs in our mind. Now, he had already had a discussion with Manmohan Singh, so I have no idea. Maybe Manmohanji told him that to say whatever. That's what he said to us. You know, when a new prime minister talks to so-called key secretaries and says we've got to do things differently, and we must get rid of cobwebs in our mind. Anyone who thinks that I need to make changes would say, hey, this is the opportunity, let's have a go. And as a matter of fact, he turned to Manmohan Singh then and said, and we gave him our views. I told him that, look, we are planning on all sorts of trade policy reforms, etc. The finance ministry guy said we must bring the deficit down and so on. Then at that point, he said, well, after we are sworn in, I'm going to have to make a speech to the nation. So he said to Manmohan, he said, Manmohan, you go and get me a draft speech. Then he said, why don't you go to your North Block office and get it? That's the first time I realized that he was going to become the finance minister. Because otherwise, where does North Block come in the picture? When Narasimha actually made the speech, it was somewhat disappointing. I mean, didn't say all the things he had said to us. So I wondered, was he going to be able to do it? But then Manmohan Singh did the devaluation. He called me and said, please explain to Chidambaram why I have to get rid of export subsidies. I went and told Chidambaram that, look, he's right that you have to get rid of export subsidies, but this is the time to push our trade reforms because at least exporters will think you gave them exim script. Chidambaram was very gung ho about it. He said, yes, let's do that. Let's go and meet him. And, it kind of unfolded pretty seamlessly. And that's the way it should be. But I think there's no question that a critical feature there, that the Prime Minister was quite clear. He may not have been clear about the details. That's what you need an architect for. He said, look, we're going to make changes now. You work out, to Manmohan say, you work out the changes. But he knew that there were going to be big changes. And he was willing to make the critical decisions. I mean, the decision on devaluation was a critical decision. And I mentioned in my book that Narasimha Rao wanted to do it in 2 steps. A little one to test the waters, and a little. I don't think that was that sensible, but that's what he wanted. When he did the first one, many of his friends sort of started protesting. So he called up Manmohan Singh and said, listen, can you hold back the second step? And Manmohan Singh told him that, look, this I'll check with Rangarajan. But that morning, Rangarajan had taken the second step. So, Rangarajan had decided with Manmohan Singh that this 2-step devaluation was going to be called hop, step, and jump. And so when Dr. Singh told him that the Prime Minister says, can we hold back the second round of the devaluation, he said, but I've already jumped. And that's how that worked out. So, easy communication, a team that had worked together, respected each other, good political support, all of that made a difference.
Okay, I think because we will be running out of time very soon, so let's jump over some periods which I was hoping to talk to you about. But then after 91, the rest of Narasimha Rao's, and then there were other few short-lived governments of Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Deve Gowda and I.K. Gujral and again Vajpayee and so on. So all that happened. Can we spend the last few minutes on the decade when you and Manmohan Singh were back as a team during the 10 years when you were Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission and he was Prime Minister? Some people call that the golden age of the reforms, except the last couple of years when we'll come to the last couple of years. But most of that period was the golden age. Was it from the inside that it looked like the golden age?
Well, by then, I think one thing we have to remember is that when the UPA government came in, I had left in the last 3 years of the Vajpayee government to take up an appointment I was offered in the IMF as head of the new independent evaluation office. So when Dr. Singh became Prime Minister, he invited me to come back and be the deputy chairman. I immediately said, wonderful, I'll resign tomorrow and come back. At that time, one of the India's growth performance was beginning to be seen to be a new potential, because India, the phrase BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, was coined in 2001 by, I forget, Goldman Sachs or one of these fellows, that these are the countries that are going to do well. So India was already being identified. And indeed, the Vajpayee government had talked about shining India and so on, understandable. But, politically, the perception that the ordinary people were benefiting had not been sold adequately. So when the UPA came in, their feeling was that this shining India was overdone, which is why the Vajpayee government lost the election. Now you have to take political reality, and the UPA government was very determined to show that we're going to get growth, but we're going to make sure that growth is inclusive. That was a mantra that we used then, inclusive growth. And so a lot of our perception was that with Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister and pretty free scope for private sector, didn't need that much more liberalization. What you needed was for the government itself and through public-private partnership to push for infrastructure development, because that's really where the government can help. The rest is done by the private sector anyway. There was some there was reluctance within the Congress party to do an aggressive privatization of the public sector. But as long as you're not expanding the public sector, you're just losing potential. They didn't have a very active program to privatize the public sector. They should have had, but they didn't. But the focus was that, look, let's see what will make growth more inclusive. And there the approach was agriculture, more education, more money on health. And of course, McNarega as a way of providing income support to landless labor. So while giving the private sector reassuring signals that, look, we like you guys, and we're expecting you to use the freedom that you've got to do well. You can bring in money from abroad if you want. And as far as the government is concerned, we'll develop infrastructure, and we'll do more than the government can through money by bringing in public-private partnership. And that was the package. And I think it was the right approach, in my view. As you say, in the last 3 years, two things happened in the last 3 years. I mean, one is the Eurozone crisis did lead to an external shock, which would have affected the economy. And some of the rise of corruption and the way it was handled very poorly, and they really they didn't seem to recognize that it was getting out of control, and they didn't they didn't address it frontally and persuade people that the scale of it is being exaggerated. The 1.76 lakh crore number which the CAG had produced, and we created the impression in the minds of people that much money in suitcases was being taken out and given to various people, whereas that was clearly a bit of a distortion. Whatever you may say about the correctness or otherwise of distributing these resources in the way they did them. So I think that I would go along with the view that the UPA government tried to build on the growth momentum and the reforms that had been done. In the first 4 or 5 years, they were very clear about reducing the fiscal deficit, and they did. A big reduction in the fiscal deficit took place. And then they ran into problems. In any system, after a while, it runs out of steam and it runs into new problems. If you're politically very astute, you can handle it. If you are not that astute, well, then you pay the consequences. But that should be viewed, in my view, as a short term, as a downturn, which cost them the election, which is, in a democracy, I guess, fair enough. I don't think it alters the underlying assumption that India's growth potential is good, providing we adopt the sensible policies needed to sustain it. And of course, I hope that we've run into other problems. Demonetization was a problem. Now we've got pandemic. These are all superimposed on an underlying trend. I think what has also changed quite a bit is the perception of the world. I mean, through the 2010s, the global environment was really one in which globalization was widely seen as the way to go. And the assumption was that China is integrating into the global economy in a relatively peaceful manner. The assumption of the Americans and the Europeans was that, look, China is benefiting from the system so much that they will themselves automatically become more democratic and less confrontational. That part hasn't happened. They become less democratic and more confrontational. So we're facing a different world. So in some sense, how we face that world and what we do, including what is happening on pandemic, including the new threat of climate change, which is going to require very solid interventions on our part, policy interventions, to deal with these new threats. So it's never the case that you just keep the agenda what it was earlier. I think every 10 years it's a good idea to say, yeah, we did a great job. Now let's talk about what is the priority now, and have a good discussion and a good public understanding of what is needed. And I think in a highly pluralistic society, a good public understanding is essential. Otherwise, you can disrupted.
So around the year 2011 is what a lot of people say, that when the reform kind of got derailed and ran out of steam. So that was partly because of all the corruption scandals, and the government got distracted and was firefighting these allegations rather than focusing on the growth and the economic agenda. So that, and then we sometimes, some journalists have called it the lost decade, the whole late UPA period to 2018 or so. And then there were, as you said, some man-made and some natural misadventures, demonetization and the botched kind of implementation of GST, and watched implementation or non-implementation of the agriculture laws and so on. So all of that has culminated in the last 2 years of pandemic. So rather than me asking you about where next, I can see lots of questions around that. Post-pandemic, where do you think India's economic policy should go? So maybe let's address that in response to questions rather than me. So I'll stop here. And there are many questions. And Sudhir, would you want to bring some questions up?
Yes, thank you so much. I'll do that. So there are a lot of questions and people have agreed to come on camera. So first I would like to invite Professor Sonal Yadav, if she can come on camera and ask the question.
Thank you, Sudhir. Very engaging conversation, Dr. Ahluwalia and Professor Ravi. So my question, I have two questions. One is, what policy measures do you suggest to improve the condition of poor and informal sector workers, because they have had a very bad impact because due to pandemic? And my second question is, which areas must be given more emphasis in the next phase of reforms?
Well, I agree with you that the pandemic has had a very negative effect on the poor. That's what people mean by the K-shaped recovery. I think, therefore, more expenditure of the kind that will support incomes in the short run, incomes in the lower part of our population, are definitely justified. I think more expenditure on health, which is necessary anyway and will actually lead to leakage, not leakage, but the side effects will all be to create more employment. Because really, to do something on health, you need to strengthen the state level health system, which actually means either more personnel or better payment for some of the people that are involved in the health service. So I would say those are very critical. Longer term, on the positive side, you have to assume, by the way, that we will get out of the pandemic problem. I mean, if you say, no, we're going to be stuck with pandemic for 5-6 years, then what I'm saying is nonsense. But, if our vaccination proceeds, we are behind target, but, one never always achieves one's target. But if you achieve it 2 months later, 3 months later, by the middle of next year, if a very large part of the Indian population is actually vaccinated, the fear of what the pandemic might do will slowly go down. It's not an immediate thing, and it could go on for some months. We don't know what this Omicron variant is going to do. At the moment, they genuinely don't know. I mean, even around the world, they're saying it'll take another 2 weeks, etc. So this is genuine uncertainty. We have no idea. We just have to wait. But one must assume that somehow we'll be able to handle the pandemic. And what we do there is not very different from what the rest of the world does. So we should be looking and seeing what's working elsewhere and make sure that we are not behind the rest of the world. Assuming, therefore, we get out of the pandemic, what else do we need to do? Well, one is quite clear that, our growth rate when we entered the pandemic was too low. Because what happened was that the UPA last 2-3 years were not good, but in the last year it was picking up. Then first 2-3 years of the present government, it picked up. Then after the demonetization and the, if you like, the glitches in the GST, it went down again. The GST, in my view, is a very major reform, and I'm glad it got done. And although there are glitches, there is talk that we'll remove them. So fixing the GST should be very, very high on the reform agenda. I think the government knows what to do. There's a lot of expertise available. We just have to do it. But doing it is not easy because, if you're going to cut down the number of rates, what it means is you've got to lower the high rates but raise the lower ones. And there's always a reluctance to raise rates, and that's an issue. But I think 2 or 3 things that we really need to do in addition to that are the following. First, we have to do better job on infrastructure, and it has to be through public-private partnership. Public-private partnership has run into problems, but then we must resolve the problem. I don't believe we can solve the problem by just having a public sector solution. We don't have the money for that. So that's one thing. Second, the banking system. The banking system is at the moment a bit broken. And we need to have a much clearer sense of what are the banking reforms that we want. In my view, we should reduce the role of the government in control of the banks. There are 2 ways of doing that. I mean, one is to relax the government control on the public sector banks, and the other is to just let 1 or 2 public sector banks be privatized. Right now, the government is doing the latter. I have no problem with privatizing 1 or 2 public sector banks if we get it done. Although, since we are saying we will retain 26%, etc., I'm not really sure what kind of privatization can be done if you want to retain 26% of a public sector bank. But, as far as the rest of the public sector banking system is concerned, I have been very much in favor of saying that we should give the Reserve Bank of India the same regulatory power on public sector banks which it has in private sector banks. At the moment, that's not true. In a private sector bank, if the RBI thinks something is going wrong, they can just remove the chairman and change the board. In public sector banks, they can't do that. They just write a letter to the finance ministry. And I think this is not good enough. They should be able to do the same thing with public sector banks. So it's very controversial. I don't think there's any support for it yet, but that's one of the issues. I think the third thing is, there's a lot of new things happening in India. Digitalization, startups, rise of new unicorns, new forms of trading in the e-commerce space. These are all very experimental. And I think there will be people saying, no, we must control all this. And part of the problem is China is handling the same thing by expanding state control. So there will be people in India who say, China is a successful country, we should learn from the Chinese. I disagree with that. I mean, I think India would be much better showing itself as an example of the non-China type approach, rather than following China's leadership in these areas. This is a controversial issue, and I don't think it's been adequately discussed, but this is certainly something that we need to do. I think the modernization of agriculture has been on the agenda for a long time. It's a pity that the farm laws became controversial. Again, it happened because I personally do not think that there was adequate discussion allowed. Now the government has said, look, we are setting up a team, which is good. I hope that this restart of the debate can lead to some sensible initiatives in this area. My instinct in this is, by the way, is that we should retain the initiative with the states rather than impose a national prescription. I mean, even earlier when we wanted, in the UPA, we wanted modernization of labor, of agriculture, including some of the marketing changes, we were saying, look, it can only be done by the states. And I think there's nothing wrong with having states compete. If some state doesn't want to do it, let them not do it. Persuade some other state. And if this state does it and does well, the other states will follow. So I think something along those lines is really needed. Finally, I mean, to do well in future, we have to have much better outcomes in skills. And frankly, there we are miserably failing. I have failed for many, many years. I don't know whether modern technology allows new forms of skilling and education, but we should experiment with all of those to see what is possible.
Thank, thank you so much, Dr. Ahluwalia. I miss you a lot when I teach a course on Indian economy, and today I'm so very fortunate to talk to you directly. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. The next question is by Professor Jimo Lunni. So I would like to invite Professor Jimo Lunni. Ma'am, if you can come on camera.
Good evening, Dr. Ahluwalia.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for coming here and speaking to our student population and our community here. My question was with regard to the economic reforms and agriculture, really, because we started in 1991, but it was mostly the trade and industry reforms. So, given you were just talking about the farm bills, given that we had these 3 farm bills now, and the farmers' agitation that followed from that, do you think that reforms in agriculture should have started sort of earlier in the day than it did? We could have stopped what happened right now. I also heard you talk about, you were thinking in terms of agriculture, education, and health, but I think all the 3 areas.
Well, let me say that I did say that in the UPA, from my recollection, we were very concerned that we should do better in agriculture. And the focus at that time was more on putting more investment into agriculture, using Magnarega to improve the water management quality in agriculture. And I think some of those initiatives did help, plus, of course, providing remunerative support prices. And altogether, during the period, those years of the UPA, agricultural performance did improve significantly compared to the previous 5 or 6 years. So that part did work. I think we were pushing for, I agree that we need modernization of the farm laws. There are 3 different farm laws here. I mean, one of them is the Essential Commodities Act. I mean, frankly, I don't even call that a farm law because it's really a retail control law. It should be abolished. I'm glad that it was there. But they tried to do it, but then they kind of didn't live up to the spirit of the thing because, having abolished the Essential Commodities Act, putting export controls on onions and so on doesn't make much sense. So I think that to my mind, it's a pity that it has got rolled up in the controversy. Similarly, on contract farming, and quite honestly, if farmers want to have, they're not forced to have contracts. I think state governments should be encouraged to define whatever rules they want on contract farming and let them do it. I think the real problem is on mandis. I don't think what has happened there is that we suddenly found the rise of a lot of suspicion about the corporate sector. Because nowadays, corporate sector means crony. I mean, if India is going to be a major economy, let's be clear, it's going to have some large Indian corporate unit. I mean, if you're going to say that the presence of a large Indian corporate means a sign of cronyism, you're condemning India to just sort of a very backward approach. But then that's how politics works. Farmers somehow seem to have been convinced that this is designed to throw them at the mercy of 1 or 2 large corporates. So I think the government has said that they don't intend to abolish mandis, but that should be made very clear. I think more than that, what you've got is now a committee. I mean, I don't know who's on it. They're still working that out. The entire economics profession, including management types, should create an environment in which the committee is forced to recognize what is sensible economics. And any recommendations that they make which don't fit in with this perception of good economics can be shown to be not serious. Let's see how it goes. We are committed. Since the government has announced they will have a committee, we're going to have a committee. So I would really urge that Ahmedabad University and the IIM and all these other people should make many representations to this committee. And then we'll see what the thinking of the committee is. It all depends on who's on it, because I have no idea yet who's going to be on it.
Thank you very much. I think that's a fascinating suggestion. We should be getting our economist friends and others together on this. Thank you.
Yes, you should. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to invite Megha Desai to ask a question. Megha, if you can switch on your camera and ask.
Namaste, sir. I'm Megha from Seva. And what we have seen is we have a larger informal sector, about 80% more than that, and 50% of that are women. And if we talk about rural areas, so larger percentage of women employment is in the land-based activities. But unfortunately, since they are not recognized as a farmer or as a worker, their contribution to economy is not counted. And so they do not have easy access to the resources of the finances. And we all know that they are nurturers. So what policies you suggest to bring their contribution in the economy? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Megaji. I mean, as you represent Seva, it's one of our best known and organizations that has done wonderful work. So one simple solution is you need more Sevas, or you need to expand the footprint of Seva so that you can strengthen this side of the economy. But more generally, I do think that over time, uh, mobilizing credit for marginalized groups is a good thing. It's happening. More needs to happen. I think one of the interesting things is whether the new kind of digitalization and fintech and so on can be used in order to support legitimate demands of credit from these segments of the population. I don't know if Seva is working with some fintech firms, but if you're not, I would strongly advise that you do that because all over the world, uh, the possibility that digital technology will actually lead to greater inclusion by people who are otherwise excluded is being widely recognized. And I can't think of too many organizations other than yours which have the background and the tradition of reaching out to groups of women. If you can marry this with the new fintechs and see whether something is possible, I think that would be great.
Thank you, Megha. Uh, now, I would like to invite Professor Pallavi Vyas to ask a question on camera. If you can unmute and ask.
Yeah, hi, Sudhir. Hi, Professor Aluwalia. Thank you for this great conversation. So I have been thinking a lot about public goods, and it just seems kind of with all the reforms, like simultaneously, there's been such little political will behind provision of public goods, and it's I don't know, like in the when you think of political economy models, you think that providing public goods usually leads to votes, and it's a electoral issue. It becomes electoral issue very quickly, but it doesn't do so in India, which is kind of, I don't know whether it does at the municipal or the state level, and it just doesn't happen at the national level, or unclear. Any thoughts would be great.
Well, that's one of the toughest questions, actually. Let me say, I agree with you that this is an empty hole, has been for a long time. If you look at it at the state level, it is unfortunately true that the perception of most state level politicians is that their electability depends on freebies rather than provision of quality public goods.
Right.
Now, quite honestly, this is a matter of educating the public that, listen, you are not better off by getting freebies. You're much better off getting quality public goods.
Right.
But you're right that there isn't an adequate, even in matters of health, for example, our political actors are preferably pushed to providing tertiary care rather than expanding primary care.
Right.
And I mean, look, this is not easy. You have to create demands for these things from the public. In an electoral democracy, if the electorate doesn't demand it, there is no reason on earth why the government should deliver it. So frankly, if there's a gap there, the electorate doesn't know what's good for it. I think we need a major effort to persuade the electorate that, look, this is what you should be demanding.
That's right.
I don't have an answer. It's really for the political scientists to tell us what to do.
That's right. Thanks. Thank you.
Now I would like to invite Professor Kaushik Jana. He has a very interesting question. So Kaushik, if you can ask that question now.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia. Yes, it's great pleasure to actually know how things work, like the privilege we are enjoying now, how that came into picture. And now when we are thinking about this kind of public health decision making, you have seen the broad horizon. Now everything now depends on the evidence, the decision we are making and the communication of the evidence. And also, when you mention that we should understand what others are doing, other country are doing, and need to understand with them part, what we can see is that we are lack with data, where the UK, US have that kind of data to make inference on any decision, like in public health, like the new variant. Even they don't have data on that variant, but we will be depending on them. When they will get a conclusion, we will copy them, or we'll make improvisation. So what is your view, how the data should be shared, and should there any regulatory body should be there who independently share data, independent of government? Your views?
Well, I mean, look, clearly, this is a very important issue because any evidence-based policy has to be based on data. And by and large, a lot of data is collected through the government. I think what we can do is to insist on transparency, insist on predetermined timelines for declaration, have good statistical systems which are run by statisticians, and have independent verification of these data by other statistical studies. It's not true that we don't have the data. I mean, we know that, if you educate the girls and the women get educated, then in due course, after a long time, many other things will happen, like a reduction in fertility rate. If you provide methods of contraception along with education, fertility rate will go down. And the most recent national health survey shows that. There has been a big decline in fertility rate according to the latest NHFS data. And the decline has also occurred in parts of the country which were earlier showing very high fertility rate. They're still showing high, but it is coming down. So I think where we haven't actually done very well is education. And particularly since education has to be geared now to the changing demands of technology. And I think that, way back in, I forget, it was 2009 or something like that, there was something called, the OECD runs a proficiency test, an international proficiency test, where groups of students take an exam, which is a standardized exam. And, India came in 2009, I think India came second from bottom in a list of 70 countries. As a result of that, the Ministry of Education withdrew from this periodic testing. But I think most recently they've changed that, so we are going back into it. So it'll be interesting to see when this test result comes out, have we improved compared to where we were in 2009? But I agree with you that you need better government data, you need more transparency, you need less political interference, you need regular schedules by which data is released. And this data needs to be validated by detailed studies. I mean, sometimes you can find that whereas the official data is saying one thing, uh, research studies show that that trend is not validated. So you need parallel, sample data to validate what the national thing is saying.
Thank you.
I have a request, Dr. Ahluwalia. I see that it is 7:30 and we requested you for 6 to 7:30 p.m. But looking at the questions now, I think it will take 10 to 15 minutes more. So I'm just checking, is that okay with you?
Yeah, we can go on for a few more minutes. Okay.
Thank you so much. So now I would like to invite Satya Das, who has a question. Satya, if you can come on camera and ask a question.
Thank you. Thank you. And sir, it's really a pleasure to hear you. Greetings from Berlin. I'm now in Berlin for a few years. I'm a biologist, so no economy I understand, but I have one little question in terms of geopolitics of what is happening across the world, but with the lens of R&D, lens of R&D, lens of critical new industries, a lens of supply chain security, as we saw in the last couple of years during the pandemic, what happened. And historically, we've been investing maybe 0.7 to 0.8% of our GDP in R&D. Given what is happening across the world, new technologies, new critical industries developing, how do you see this play out for India? What we should be doing in the next 10 years?
No, it's quite clear. It's quite clear to me that if we have any ambition of being regarded as, let's say, one of the successful developing countries over the next 20 years, we are grossly underinvesting in R&D. That's point number one. Point number two is, nor can the solution be simply that private sector should invest. They should, and they're not. But the government should also invest, because it is government investment that provides the base of R&D, and then the private sector converts it into patentable results, etc. But without that government base, that's not going to happen. So I'm quite clear the government needs to do that. In fact, in my book, I mention that we need to invest at least something like 0.5% or more of GDP in research and development than we are doing. Public sector, private sector is separate. But even more than that, we need to invest it in a manner which is responsive to effective use of the money. And when I was in the government, I had suggested that we need more money for research, but the money should not be given in the form of budget support for existing government research institutions. We should set up a national science research fund and invite people, whether private or public or joint private and public, to submit research proposals and choose the best one. Now, the scientists were all very much in favor of more money, but they wanted it going through their existing budgets, which in my view is not the right thing to do. I don't know what they do in Germany, but certainly in the United States, it's competitive funding, and universities in the public sector and the private sector, and even private corporate guys can apply for these funds, and you allocate them in the right manner. I think we have a big problem there, because we have only one university in the top list of top 500, that is the Indian Institute of Science. Many of the IITs are very good at producing undergraduates. In fact, some of the quality of undergraduates they produce is brilliant, but the quality of research they produce is nowhere near that. In fact, most of these undergraduates leave the country and go to other universities abroad. We haven't yet created, even the IITs have not been converted into places that produce good research. I'm not against people going abroad. Quite honestly, if there are better universities abroad, there's no harm in our chaps going there and learning something, and maybe some of them will come back. But given that we have IITs that produce such good undergraduates, we should be structurally thinking of how can we make these places into research universities, and we're not doing enough on that. Now, you mentioned cybersecurity, and that's a huge area. And frankly, if we are not up to scratch on there, we can become very vulnerable. and particularly with all this Internet of Things. I mean, if you can hack, if you're a digitalized world with a lot of Internet of Things going on, the ability of someone to hack into any part of your system is immense. And I don't even know how. I mean, there's a real danger that some of this will actually just be taken over by the security guys and sort of clamp down. That would not be very productive either. So I don't know how we handle that, but it's a big issue, really.
Sorry. Thanks for unmuting me. Thank you, sir. Yeah, I did. If you have 30 seconds more, I did also ask about supply chain security.
That's a very important point because, but supply chain security. I mean, you can, for certain areas, you can block out certain sources. Period. For other areas, you diversify sources. That's the solution, really. I mean, I don't think that supply chain security means that everything must be inside the country.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. No, I had a little.
That's only my view. I don't know what the government's view is on this. So, this is an open issue which is still being discussed, I'm sure.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now I would like to invite Professor Ravi Miklani to say a few words.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, just to close, sorry, we have taken more of your time than we had asked for. So just to quickly close on this has been fascinating. It took me down memory lane. Maybe it took you down memory lane, but those early 90s days were very heady and very intoxicating for people of our generation. The younger people might not know what we are talking about, but those were very interesting days, and it was so good to read your book and then listen live to you about what was going on behind the scenes in those days. So that was great. Well, just one last request from me, because as I said, a lot of our audience and a lot of the people in the country have no first-hand view on what was going on in the country before and soon after 1991. Other than your own excellent book, which I would recommend everyone to read, are there any books that you think our students or younger colleagues should look at to understand the history of economic policy in India?
Well, that's very difficult because these are all my friends. So there's no dearth of books, actually. So if you look at any of this, there are several books that have come out. But I can't immediately, I mean, I've not been deeply looking at some of these things. I can't think of any one that I would recommend. I just recommend read my book again and try to reflect on it, I think.
Yes, yeah, that certainly is an excellent and in-depth behind-the-scenes look. So that certainly is highly recommended. So thank you so much. And this conversation could go on for hours. There's so much to dig into your 3 decades of association with policymaking, and the way you are so passionately still engaged in understanding where India's economy is and where it needs to go. We hope that in some shape or form you might find a role in which your views can play a role in active policy making as an advisor, hopefully, because you have very clear and strong views on what India needs to do. So hopefully you are being heard in the corridors of power still, and your views might steer India in a better direction. So with that hope, thank you so much. And hopefully we will get to our beautiful campus in Ahmedabad at some point.
Yeah, I look forward to that. That'd be very nice.
And thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.